"Ma'am, step away from the gate." The voice cut through the cool morning air before the woman had taken more than 3 steps toward the checkpoint. She stopped without protest and looked up at the young guard standing inside the security booth. Fort Liberty was just beginning to wake up. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the pavement, painting long shadows beneath the guard towers and administrative buildings beyond the fence. A line of civilian contractors waited patiently at the visitor lane while military vehicles rolled through the secured entrance. The woman adjusted the strap of the small leather bag resting on her shoulder and offered a polite smile. She looked nothing like someone important. Dark jeans, brown boots, a navy jacket zipped halfway against the morning chill. Her chest carried no rank, no insignia, no visible authority. To anyone passing by, she could have been a teacher, an accountant, or a visitor who had taken a wrong turn somewhere along the highway. The guard glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to a tablet resting on the counter. "Can I help you?" he asked. His tone suggested the opposite. The woman calmly reached into her bag and removed a folder. "Good morning. I'm here for official business." The guard accepted the folder with one hand while sipping coffee with the other. His name tag read Ethan Brooks. He couldn't have been older than 21. Fresh-faced, confident, the kind of confidence that often arrived before experience did. He flipped through the documents without much interest. "You'll need to check in at the visitor center first. These orders authorize direct access." Ethan barely looked at her. "Everybody says that." The woman remained silent. Around them, the base continued its routine. Trucks entered through neighboring lanes. Soldiers crossed the parking lot carrying gym bags and breakfast trays. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle echoed faintly across the installation. The woman's eyes moved across the surroundings. She noticed details most people ignored. A faded inspection sticker on the security booth window. A maintenance log hanging and signed inside the station. A flag at the front entrance that had not been raised quite correctly. Small things, individually meaningless. Together, they painted a picture. Ethan continued flipping through the paperwork. "Who exactly are you meeting?" he asked. "The command staff." "That's a pretty big group." "Yes, it is." Ethan finally looked up. Something about her calmness irritated him. Most people became nervous when questioned at a military gate. This woman seemed perfectly comfortable standing there. "Do you have military identification?" She handed him a card. He studied it for several seconds. His eyebrows narrowed slightly. Then he looked at her again. Then back at the card. "This doesn't make sense." "What part?" "The part where this says you're assigned here." The woman nodded. "That part is accurate." Ethan let out a small laugh and shook his head. "Nice try." The contractor waiting behind her shifted awkwardly. Another guard glanced over from a nearby lane. The woman showed no reaction. "Would you like me to explain the paperwork?" she asked. "No, ma'am. What I'd like is for you to step aside until we figure out what's going on." Her expression never changed. If anything, she appeared curious. "And what exactly do you think is going on?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "I think somebody made a mistake." The woman slowly folded her hands in front of her. "That's possible." Ethan seemed encouraged by her answer. "Good. Then we agree." For the first time, a faint smile appeared on her face. It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't defensive. It was the smile of someone observing a lesson unfold exactly as expected. The morning breeze moved through the checkpoint. Beyond the gate, Fort Liberty stood waiting. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of buildings, years of tradition, responsibilities that affected every person living and working on the installation. The woman looked through the fence toward the headquarters building in the distance. Then she looked back at Ethan Brooks. "You're new here, aren't you?" she asked. Ethan straightened slightly. "Been here 4 months." "I see. Why?" The woman paused before answering. "Because someday you'll remember this morning." Ethan frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" She simply smiled again. "Nothing at all." The woman remained exactly where she was while Ethan Brooks carried her identification card back into the security booth. He sat down, opened a database window, and began typing with the confidence of someone certain he was about to prove a point. Outside, the morning traffic continued moving through Fort Liberty. Soldiers reported for duty. Maintenance crews rolled equipment across the installation. Delivery trucks arrived at scheduled checkpoints. To everyone else, it was an ordinary morning. To the woman standing calmly beside the visitor lane, it was becoming a very informative one. Her eyes traveled across the base entrance again. She noticed a maintenance vehicle parked in a fire lane, a clipboard hanging unattended near a security terminal, two guards chatting while a vehicle inspection was only half completed. None of the mistakes were catastrophic, yet together they revealed something larger. Standards had slipped. Procedures had become habits. Habits had become shortcuts. And shortcuts had become normal. Inside the booth, Ethan frowned at his monitor. He checked the identification number again. Then he checked it a second time. The records continued returning the same result. That irritated him even more. He glanced through the window toward the woman. She stood patiently with her hands folded, showing no sign of frustration. Most people would have become defensive by now. Some would have demanded a supervisor. Others would have complained loudly enough to draw attention from everyone nearby. She simply waited. That calmness bothered him more than any argument could have. Another guard approached the booth carrying a paper cup. His name tag read Martinez. He looked from Ethan to the woman outside. "What is going on?" he asked. Ethan lowered his voice. "Something is off with her paperwork." Martinez glanced toward the visitor lane. "She does not look dangerous." "That is not the point." "Then what is the point?" Ethan turned the monitor slightly. Martinez studied the screen for several seconds. His expression changed. "That cannot be right." "Exactly. Did you verify it?" "3 times." Martinez looked outside again. The woman noticed the exchange, but said nothing. She simply watched the flag above the entrance moving gently in the breeze. A few moments later, a staff sergeant emerged from a nearby administration building. He stopped beside the checkpoint and asked why traffic was slowing. Ethan quickly explained the situation. The staff sergeant listened while reviewing the paperwork. His forehead creased slightly. Then he looked at the woman. "Ma'am, how long have you been waiting?" "Not very long." "I apologize for the delay." Ethan immediately interrupted. "Sergeant, the documentation is inconsistent." The staff sergeant studied him for a moment. "Inconsistent how?" Ethan pointed toward the file. "The assignment information does not match what she looks like." The moment the words left his mouth, Martinez lowered his eyes toward the ground. Even the staff sergeant seemed surprised by the answer. The woman, however, showed no reaction at all. She simply tilted her head slightly. "And what exactly should an assignment look like?" she asked. Ethan realized too late how the statement sounded. His face reddened. "That is not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" For the first time since arriving, the woman asked the question with genuine curiosity. Ethan searched for an answer but could not find one that sounded better than the original statement. Fortunately for him, the staff sergeant stepped in. "Private Brooks is still learning." "We all are," the woman replied. The staff sergeant nodded politely and stepped away to make a phone call. As he walked off, the woman watched him disappear behind a nearby building. She already knew what would happen next. Verification would begin. Names would be checked. Questions would be asked. Eventually, someone higher in the chain would receive a call. Then another call. Then another. The truth always traveled upward before it came back down. Across the checkpoint, Ethan crossed his arms and leaned against the counter. He still believed he was protecting the installation. In his mind, caution was better than embarrassment. The problem was that caution without observation often created its own mistakes. Several minutes passed. The morning sun climbed higher. More personnel moved through the gates. Some glanced curiously toward the woman waiting outside. Others ignored the scene entirely. Then a radio crackled inside the booth. Ethan reached for it automatically. The voice on the other end was calm but direct. "Private Brooks, remain at your station. A senior officer is en route to the checkpoint." Ethan exchanged a confident look with Martinez. "See," he said quietly. "I told you something was wrong." Outside, the woman looked toward the road leading deeper into Fort Liberty. A small smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. Not because she enjoyed the situation. Not because anyone was about to be embarrassed. She smiled because the real inspection had finally begun, and nobody at the gate realized they were already part of it. The radio transmission changed the atmosphere at the checkpoint more than anyone wanted to admit. Ethan Brooks tried to appear relaxed, but he found himself checking the road every few seconds. Whoever was coming carried enough authority to interrupt the normal flow of operations, and that alone made him uneasy. Across the lane, the woman remained exactly where she had been for nearly half an hour. She did not pace. She did not complain. She did not ask for updates. Instead, she watched Fort Liberty come alive around her. A formation of soldiers crossed a distant parking lot. Maintenance crews inspected utility vehicles. A pair of junior officers hurried toward headquarters carrying folders and coffee cups. The installation functioned like a living machine, thousands of people moving through routines that had been repeated for years. Yet the woman noticed something else. People were moving quickly, but not precisely. Procedures were being completed, but not carefully. Standards existed, but they were no longer being enforced with pride. That concerned her far more than being delayed at the gate. Martinez stepped out of the booth and approached her. Unlike Ethan, his voice carried genuine professionalism. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience." "There is no inconvenience," she replied. "Everyone is doing what they believe is correct." Martinez hesitated. That is a generous way of looking at it. A faint smile touched her face. Leadership becomes easier when you assume good intentions first. Before Martinez could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle drew attention from everyone nearby. A dark government sedan rolled toward the checkpoint and stopped beside the security station. The driver remained inside while a lieutenant colonel stepped out from the passenger side. Ethan immediately straightened his posture. The officer moved with purpose, carrying the unmistakable presence of someone accustomed to making decisions. Ethan felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone senior enough to resolve the situation had arrived. The lieutenant colonel accepted the paperwork without speaking. He reviewed every page carefully. His eyes moved from the documents to the woman and back again. Several seconds passed, then several more. Ethan waited for confirmation that he had done the right thing. Instead, the officer looked directly at him. "Private Brooks, walk me through exactly what happened." Ethan eagerly explained everything. He described the identification card, the assignment records, the discrepancies he believed he had discovered, and the caution he had exercised. As he spoke, the lieutenant colonel listened without interruption. When Ethan finished, the officer folded the paperwork and asked a single question. "Did the credentials verify?" Ethan blinked. "Yes, sir." "Did the database confirm the assignment?" "Yes, sir." "Did you find evidence of fraud?" "No, sir." The lieutenant colonel nodded slowly. "Then what discrepancy did you discover?" Ethan opened his mouth, but found no immediate answer. The silence that followed felt longer than it really was. Nearby guards pretended not to listen while listening to every word. Finally, Ethan said, "Something just seemed off, sir." The officer studied him carefully. "Based on what?" Once again, Ethan had no answer. The woman said nothing. She simply observed the exchange. The lieutenant colonel returned the folder to her. "Thank you for your patience, ma'am." "Of course." Ethan looked from one person to the other. Confusion began replacing confidence. The officer was being unusually respectful, more respectful than the situation seemed to require. Then the lieutenant colonel glanced toward the headquarters complex and checked his watch. "The command staff briefing begins in less than 45 minutes, he said. "Timing is becoming important." The statement sounded ordinary, yet something about it caught Martinez's attention. He looked toward the woman. She simply nodded once. That brief exchange raised even more questions than it answered. A second vehicle suddenly appeared at the far end of the road. Then another. The small convoy moved steadily toward the checkpoint. Several soldiers stopped what they were doing to watch. Government vehicles were common at Fort Liberty, but these carried markings rarely seen outside senior command visits. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The lieutenant colonel noticed the approaching convoy and immediately adjusted his uniform. Martinez stood straighter. Even the staff sergeant who had been making phone calls moments earlier returned at a near jog. One by one, personnel around the checkpoint became alert. The woman watched the vehicles approach without the slightest change in expression. As the convoy closed the final few hundred yards, a realization slowly began spreading through the people at the gate. Someone important was arriving. Very important. The only question remaining was who the visitor had come to meet. Ethan Brooks still believed he knew the answer. Within the next few minutes, he would discover how completely wrong he was. The convoy rolled to a smooth stop just outside the checkpoint, and for a moment the entire entrance to Fort Liberty seemed to pause. Conversations ended. Vehicle inspections slowed. Even the contractors waiting in line turned their attention toward the black SUVs. Ethan Brooks felt his pulse quicken as the first rear door opened. He expected a visiting official, perhaps an inspector from regional command or a senior operations officer. Instead, two uniformed aides stepped out and immediately moved to either side of the lead vehicle. Their presence alone signaled a level of authority rarely seen at the front gate. The lieutenant colonel standing nearby straightened his shoulders and glanced toward the woman who had been waiting all morning. She remained completely calm. No excitement, no anticipation, no sign that anything unusual was happening. That detail should have meant something to Ethan, but he was too focused on the convoy itself. A second SUV door opened, then a third. Several senior officers emerged and exchanged brief words before looking toward the checkpoint. To Ethan's surprise, none of them headed toward headquarters. None of them entered the base. Instead, every one of them seemed focused on the same person standing beside the visitor lane. Martinez noticed it too. The staff sergeant noticed it. Even the contractors waiting behind the security barrier began whispering among themselves. The woman looked at her watch, then at the convoy, then back toward the main gate. It was almost as if she were evaluating whether the delay had become excessive. The lieutenant colonel stepped forward and approached her. "Ma'am, thank you for your patience." "You already thanked me once," she replied politely. "Then allow me to thank you again." Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. Something about the conversation was no longer making sense. Senior officers did not speak this way to random visitors. They certainly did not apologize repeatedly to them. Before he could process the thought, one of the aides from the convoy approached carrying a tablet. He stopped beside the lieutenant colonel and quietly delivered an update. The officer nodded and looked toward the woman. "The command staff has assembled. Earlier than expected," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Ethan heard the response clearly. So did everyone else standing nearby. The tone was unmistakable, respectful, professional, immediate, the kind of response given to someone high in the chain of command. Yet Ethan still could not connect the pieces. The woman wore no visible rank, no insignia, no indication of authority. She looked more like a consultant arriving for a meeting than someone capable of commanding a military installation. The contradiction kept pulling at his assumptions. The woman turned toward him for the first time in several minutes. "Private Brooks." Ethan blinked. "Yes, ma'am." "How long have you been assigned here?" "For months, ma'am." "Do you enjoy the work?" The question caught him completely off guard. "I do, ma'am." "Good." She nodded thoughtfully. "Gate security is important work." Ethan found himself standing straighter. "Thank you, ma'am." She glanced toward the installation beyond the fence. "The gate is the first impression people receive. Every standard starts here." Ethan followed her gaze. For the first time that morning, he noticed some of the things she had probably seen immediately. The neglected maintenance log, the poorly parked vehicle, the incomplete inspection procedures. Small details. Details he had stopped noticing weeks ago. Before he could respond, another officer approached at a near jog. He carried a folder and handed it directly to the lieutenant colonel. The officer reviewed the contents, then looked toward the woman. "Everything is prepared." "Excellent," she replied. The officer stepped aside. The checkpoint grew quieter. Nobody understood exactly what was happening, but everyone sensed they were standing at the edge of an important moment. The woman reached into her bag and removed a pair of reading glasses. She reviewed a document briefly before returning it to the folder. Then she looked at the lieutenant colonel. "Before we proceed, I would like a complete briefing on personnel readiness, maintenance compliance, and retention numbers." "Yes, ma'am. And I would like the briefing exactly as it exists, not the version people think I want to hear." "Understood." Ethan felt the knot in his stomach tighten further. Visitors did not request readiness reports. Consultants did not ask for retention statistics. Whoever this woman was, her authority extended far beyond anything he had imagined. Yet the biggest revelation was still moments away, waiting just beyond the gate that he himself had refused to open. The tension at the checkpoint had changed completely. Earlier that morning, people had gathered out of curiosity. Now they remained because something larger was unfolding before their eyes. Soldiers walking toward administrative buildings slowed their pace. Drivers waiting in line lowered their windows. Even personnel who had no reason to stop found reasons to linger nearby. Nobody wanted to leave before discovering who the woman really was. Ethan Brooks stood beside the security booth, trying to maintain his professional appearance while questions raced through his mind. Every passing minute seemed to reveal another clue that contradicted his original assumptions. The senior officers arriving from the convoy treated the woman with obvious respect. Staff members appeared eager to accommodate her requests. Yet she continued standing outside the gate as though none of it mattered. That was perhaps the strangest detail of all. Most important visitors would have demanded immediate access. She had done the opposite. She had waited. She had observed. She had listened. It was almost as if she wanted to see how Fort Liberty operated before anyone knew who she was. Nearby, the lieutenant colonel finished a brief conversation with one of the aides and returned to her side. Transportation is ready whenever you are. The woman nodded but did not move. Instead, she looked toward the security station again. How often are gate procedures audited? The lieutenant colonel seemed surprised by the question. Quarterly, ma'am. And the last review? 3 months ago. Interesting. Her eyes drifted toward the maintenance log hanging crookedly inside the booth. I suspect a follow-up review would be beneficial. The officer followed her gaze and immediately understood what she meant. Ethan felt his face grow warm. For the first time, he realized that the morning had never been about paperwork. It had been about observation. Every detail around the checkpoint had been quietly evaluated from the moment she arrived. The woman then turned toward Martinez. How long have you been assigned to gate operations? 2 years, ma'am. What is the biggest challenge? Martinez answered without hesitation. Complacency. A faint smile appeared on her face. That is an honest answer. Martinez shrugged slightly. It is also the truth. The woman nodded approvingly. Around them, several officers exchanged brief glances. They seemed to be paying close attention to every word she spoke. Ethan noticed that too. The realization unsettled him even further. Whoever she was, her opinion clearly carried weight. A great deal of weight. Another SUV door opened, and a civilian official stepped out carrying a thick binder. He approached quickly and handed it to one of the aides. The binder contained briefing materials, schedules, personnel reports, and installation statistics. The woman accepted it and casually flipped through several pages. She paused only once. Retention numbers improved last quarter. The aide looked surprised. Yes, ma'am. But maintenance compliance dropped. Also correct. She closed the binder. That trend concerns me. The aide nodded immediately. Understood. Ethan stared. She had reviewed dozens of pages in seconds and identified 2 specific trends without hesitation. That was not luck. That was experience. Serious experience. The crowd around the checkpoint continued growing. A few soldiers whispered theories. Some thought she was an inspector from Washington. Others guessed she might be attached to regional command. One private quietly suggested she could be part of a congressional review team. None of the theories felt quite right. The reality was far more significant. The woman checked her watch once more. We should not delay the staff any longer. The lieutenant colonel nodded. Agreed, ma'am. He turned toward the gate. Open access immediately. Ethan moved automatically toward the control panel. His hand stopped halfway. A strange feeling settled over him. Once the gate opened, whatever mystery remained would disappear. The answer that everyone had been waiting for all morning stood only a few steps away. He pressed the control. The barrier began to move. The crowd watched in silence. The woman picked up her bag and started forward. Then she stopped unexpectedly and looked back toward Ethan. The young guard immediately straightened. Private Brooks. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for taking your responsibilities seriously. Ethan blinked. Of all the things he expected her to say, that was not one of them. I was only doing my job, ma'am. Good, she replied. Never stop doing that. Then she stepped through the gate as officers and aides fell into position around her. Ethan watched the group move toward the waiting vehicles. The mystery was almost over now. Within minutes, every person at Fort Liberty would learn exactly who had been standing outside their gate all morning. And when that moment arrived, the entire installation would understand why this ordinary-looking visitor had quietly changed the atmosphere of the base before ever stepping inside. The convoy moved steadily through Fort Liberty while the morning routine continued around it. Yet word was already spreading faster than any official announcement. Soldiers noticed the unusual collection of senior officers. Administrative staff saw the vehicles heading directly toward headquarters. Questions began moving through offices, motor pools, maintenance facilities, and training areas. Something important was happening. Inside the lead SUV, the woman sat quietly beside the lieutenant colonel. She reviewed briefing materials while the installation passed outside her window. Barracks, training fields, maintenance yards, administrative buildings. She studied everything. Not because she was unfamiliar with military bases. Quite the opposite. Years of leadership had taught her that the health of an organization revealed itself long before the first briefing ever began. A freshly painted building could hide serious problems. A polished presentation could conceal declining standards. Real leadership required looking beyond appearances. "The command team is waiting in Conference Room Alpha," the lieutenant colonel said. "How many are attending?" she asked. 32 senior leaders, ma'am." She nodded. "And how many know I arrived this morning?" The officer hesitated. "Very few." "Good." She returned her attention to the documents. Outside the vehicle, Fort Liberty continued operating under the assumption that another normal workday had begun. Yet inside headquarters, tension was building. Conference Room Alpha was already full. Colonels, lieutenant colonels, command sergeants major, directors, and department chiefs occupied nearly every seat. Several checked their watches repeatedly. Others reviewed reports one final time. Nobody seemed entirely comfortable. The installation had experienced months of uncertainty. Rumors about leadership changes had circulated for weeks. Personnel knew someone new was coming. They simply did not know who. Near the back of the room, one officer leaned toward another. "Have you heard anything?" "Nothing confirmed. The Pentagon does not send this many people for routine assignments." "Exactly." Their conversation ended when the doors opened and another aide entered carrying updated briefing folders. The atmosphere immediately tightened. Meanwhile, back at the gate, Ethan Brooks remained standing near the security station long after the convoy disappeared. He replayed every conversation from the morning, every answer, every question, every detail. The more he thought about it, the more one realization bothered him. She had never once attempted to use authority. She had never raised her voice, never demanded special treatment, never mentioned rank. Most people with power often felt the need to display it. She had done the opposite. Martinez walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Ethan. "You look like you were solving a mystery." Ethan accepted the cup. "I think I missed something obvious." Martinez laughed quietly. "That makes 2 of us. Do you know who she is?" "No, but you have a guess." Martinez stared toward headquarters. "I think everybody on this base is about to find out." Several miles away in the command building parking lot, the convoy came to a stop. Aides moved quickly. Officers assembled. The woman stepped out and looked toward the headquarters entrance. The building itself was impressive, large, modern, efficient. Yet she noticed the same pattern she had seen at the gate. Small details, small signs, small warnings, none serious on their own. Together they told a story about standards that had slowly drifted, a story about leaders who had become comfortable, a story about a base that still possessed enormous potential but needed direction. She picked up her bag and began walking toward the entrance. Every officer nearby immediately fell into step. Inside the conference room, conversation stopped the moment someone announced that the convoy had arrived. 32 senior leaders rose from their seats. Silence filled the room. Footsteps approached from the hallway. The doors opened. One by one, aides entered, then senior officers, then additional staff members. Finally, the woman from the gate appeared in the doorway. Several people exchanged confused glances. A few frowned. Some clearly assumed there had been a scheduling mistake. Then every officer who had accompanied her came to attention. The room became completely still. At that exact moment, throughout Fort Liberty, phones began vibrating with a newly released command message. Personnel opened the notification. Administrative offices went quiet. Maintenance crews stopped talking. Training instructors lowered their tablets. Security personnel looked at their screens. And at the front gate, Ethan Brooks felt his stomach drop as he read the first line. For the first time that morning, the mystery finally disappeared. The woman he had delayed, questioned, and evaluated was not a visitor, not an inspector, and not a consultant. She was the new commanding authority of Fort Liberty, and within seconds the entire installation was about to learn her name. For several seconds, nobody inside Conference Room Alpha moved. The command message had reached every corner of Fort Liberty at the exact moment the woman stepped through the doorway. The screen of every government phone displayed the same announcement. Brigadier General Ava Mitchell had officially assumed command of the installation. Years of distinguished leadership, multiple successful command assignments, a reputation for rebuilding organizations that had lost their direction. The information spread through the base like a wave. In maintenance shops, soldiers lowered their devices and exchanged stunned looks. In administrative offices, conversations stopped mid-sentence. At the front gate, Ethan Brooks read the message twice before the words finally settled into place. Brigadier General. Not Colonel. Not Inspector. Not Advisor. A General Officer. The realization hit harder than he expected. Every interaction from that morning replayed through his mind. The questions she had asked. The details she had noticed. The calm way she had observed everything around her. Suddenly, every moment made sense. Back inside headquarters, 32 senior leaders stood at attention as Ava Mitchell entered the conference room. No one appeared confused anymore. The uncertainty had vanished. In its place was something else. Respect. Not because of the stars on her uniform record. Not because of the title attached to her name. Respect because many of them had already heard what happened at the gate. They knew she had arrived alone. They knew she had spent nearly an hour observing the installation without announcing her authority. They knew she had chosen to learn before she chose to lead. Ava walked to the front of the room and placed her folder on the conference table. The room remained silent. She studied the faces before her. Experienced officers. Talented leaders. People responsible for thousands of soldiers and civilians. Some appeared confident. Others looked nervous. A few seemed uncertain about what kind of commander had just arrived. Ava understood exactly what they were thinking because she had seen the same expressions many times throughout her career. She finally spoke. Good morning. Her voice was calm and steady. Nothing about it sounded dramatic. Yet every person in the room listened carefully. Before we begin, I would like to thank everyone for being here. Several officers exchanged brief glances. The opening was not what they expected. Ava continued. This morning I had an opportunity to spend time at the front gate. More glances followed. The story had already circulated. I learned something important. The room became even quieter. I learned that Fort Liberty still has people who care deeply about doing their jobs. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. I also learned that standards have become inconsistent. That statement landed differently. Not harsh. Not accusatory. Simply factual. Ava opened her folder. The good news is that problems can be fixed. She looked around the room. The better news is that I believe this installation has the people necessary to fix them. Several leaders visibly relaxed. They had expected criticism. Instead, they heard confidence. Ava spent the next several minutes discussing readiness, maintenance, retention, and leadership culture. She asked direct questions. She listened carefully to the answers. More importantly, she noticed which answers sounded rehearsed and which sounded honest. Experience had taught her that data mattered, but character mattered more. Meanwhile, at the front gate, Ethan remained unusually quiet. Martinez eventually set down a clipboard and looked at him. You finally know who she is. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah. Rough morning. Ethan let out a breath. You could say that. Martinez surprised him with a small smile. You know what I think? What? I think she already made her decision about you. Ethan looked up immediately. What decision? Martinez shrugged. The same one she makes about everyone. Whether they are willing to learn. Ethan thought about that. The general could have embarrassed him. She could have corrected him publicly. She could have used her authority at any moment. Instead, she had asked questions. She had observed. She had given him opportunities to think. The more he reflected on it, the more uncomfortable he felt about his own assumptions. Hours later, as meetings continued inside headquarters, one thing had become clear throughout Fort Liberty. Their new commander was not interested in appearances. She was interested in standards. She was not impressed by polished speeches. She was impressed by honest effort. And before her first official briefing had even ended, people across the installation were already beginning to see themselves differently. The gate had delayed a general that morning, but in the process it had revealed exactly why she had been chosen to lead Fort Liberty. The first day under Brigadier General Ava Mitchell's command continued long after the initial briefing ended. Across Fort Liberty, people adjusted to a reality that had arrived without warning. The stories from the gate spread faster than any official memorandum. By early afternoon, nearly everyone had heard some version of what happened. Some details changed depending on who told the story, but one fact remained consistent. The new commanding general had arrived alone, dressed like an ordinary visitor, and spent nearly an hour observing the installation before anyone realized who she was. In headquarters, department leaders moved from conference room to conference room carrying reports, schedules, readiness assessments, and personnel data. Ava reviewed everything carefully. She asked direct questions and expected honest answers. What surprised many people was not the difficulty of her questions. It was her willingness to listen. Several officers arrived prepared to defend decisions. Instead, they found themselves discussing solutions. Several senior non-commissioned officers expected criticism. Instead, they found themselves discussing standards. The atmosphere gradually shifted from anxiety to focus. Meanwhile, at the front gate, Ethan Brooks could not stop thinking about the morning. Every vehicle that approached seemed to remind him of the moment he had looked at a verified identification card and still trusted his assumptions more than the evidence in front of him. He completed inspections, checked credentials, logged arrivals, yet his thoughts kept returning to the same lesson. Near the end of his shift, the staff sergeant approached holding a clipboard. "Brooks, Sergeant, you are requested at headquarters tomorrow morning." Ethan immediately felt his stomach tighten. "Headquarters? 0800. Do you know why?" The staff sergeant gave him a look that answered the question without words. Ethan nodded slowly. The rest of the afternoon seemed longer than usual. By evening, he had convinced himself of several possible outcomes, and none of them felt encouraging. Throughout the installation, however, something else was happening. Small corrections began appearing everywhere. Maintenance logs were updated. Inspection procedures became more thorough. Uniform standards improved. Supervisors who had previously ignored minor issues suddenly paid attention again. Nobody had been ordered to change. Nobody had been threatened. Yet the example set that morning had accomplished something unusual. People were examining their own habits. They were asking themselves whether they had become comfortable with standards that should never have slipped. The following morning arrived clear and cool. Ethan reported to headquarters 15 minutes early. The building looked different now, not because it had changed, but because he noticed details he had ignored before. The flag outside was perfectly positioned. The landscaping was carefully maintained. Every person entering the building moved with purpose. Ethan checked in at reception and was directed to a waiting area outside the command suite. Minutes later, an aide appeared. "Private Brooks, this way." Ethan followed him through a series of hallways until they reached an office overlooking the installation. Large windows provided a view of roads, training areas, and administrative buildings stretching across the base. Ava Mitchell stood near the glass reviewing a report. She looked up as Ethan entered. "Private Brooks." "Ma'am." "At ease." Ethan obeyed, though his nerves remained obvious. Ava set the report aside and gestured toward a chair. "Have a seat." Ethan hesitated before sitting. He expected a formal correction, perhaps a counseling statement, maybe even disciplinary paperwork. Instead, Ava remained standing beside the window. "Tell me what you learned yesterday." The question surprised him. "Ma'am, what did you learn?" Ethan considered the answer carefully. "I learned that assumptions can create mistakes." Ava nodded. "Good. What else?" "I learned that credentials matter more than appearances." "Anything else?" Ethan thought for a moment. "I learned that leadership can show up looking different than expected." A small smile appeared on Ava's face. "That is true." The office fell quiet. Outside, vehicles moved through the installation far below. Finally, Ava spoke again. "Do you know why I asked you here?" "No, ma'am." "Because I wanted to meet the soldier who took his responsibilities seriously enough to stop a stranger at the gate." Ethan blinked. That was not where he expected the conversation to go. Ava continued. "Your mistake was not caution. Your mistake was allowing assumptions to influence judgment." Ethan nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Those are very different things." She walked toward the desk and picked up a folder. "Skills can be taught. Procedures can be improved. Character is harder to build." She looked directly at him. "Yesterday I saw someone who cared enough to do the job. What happens next depends on whether that person is willing to keep learning." For the first time since receiving the meeting notice, Ethan felt the tension begin to disappear. He realized this conversation was never about punishment. It was about growth. And as the morning sunlight filled the office overlooking Fort Liberty, the lesson Ava Mitchell started teaching at the gate was still continuing. The meeting with Brigadier General Ava Mitchell stayed with Ethan Brooks long after he left headquarters. As he walked back across Fort Liberty, the installation looked different than it had only 2 days earlier. The roads were the same. The buildings were the same. The people were the same. Yet something had changed. Standards were improving. Conversations sounded more purposeful. Leaders spent more time in the field and less time behind closed doors. Small corrections appeared everywhere. None of them came from fear. They came from awareness. Ava Mitchell had not arrived promising dramatic change. She had arrived asking people to see what had been right in front of them all along. Over the following weeks, Fort Liberty continued evolving. Maintenance compliance improved. Readiness scores increased. Retention numbers stabilized. More importantly, trust began returning to the organization. Soldiers noticed that problems were addressed honestly rather than hidden. Leaders became more visible. Expectations became clearer. The installation slowly rediscovered something it had been missing: pride. Ethan felt the change personally. Every day at the gate became an opportunity to apply the lesson he had learned. He still checked credentials carefully. He still followed procedures. But he no longer allowed assumptions to fill gaps where facts belonged. Sometimes visitors arrived in expensive vehicles. Sometimes they arrived in old pickup trucks. Some looked exactly like the positions they held. Others did not. Ethan treated them all the same: professional, respectful, fair. One afternoon, nearly a month after Ava Mitchell assumed command, a leadership forum was held inside the base auditorium. Soldiers from across Fort Liberty attended. Officers, non-commissioned officers, civilians, and junior enlisted personnel filled the seats. The purpose of the event was simple: open discussion, questions, ideas, solutions. Near the end of the session, Ava stood at the podium and looked across the audience. "Leadership is often misunderstood," she said. "Many people think it begins with authority. It does not." The room remained silent. Authority can give you a position. It cannot earn respect. Several heads nodded. Respect comes from competence, character, consistency. The people around you decide whether you deserve it. Ethan sat near the back of the auditorium, listening carefully. He knew those words were not theoretical. They reflected exactly how she had led from the moment she arrived. Ava continued, "One of the most important lessons I learned in my career came from being underestimated." The audience listened closely. People will sometimes judge you before they know you. They will make assumptions. They will decide who you are before you speak a single word. She paused. Do not waste energy trying to control their assumptions. Focus on your actions instead. The room remained completely still. Eventually, character speaks louder than appearances ever can. After the event ended, soldiers slowly filtered toward the exits. Conversations filled the hallways. Ethan remained in his seat for a few moments. Not because he needed to hear more, because he finally understood the full lesson. That morning at the gate had never been about embarrassment. It had never been about rank. It had never been about proving someone wrong. Ava Mitchell could have revealed her position immediately. She could have demanded access. She could have ended the entire situation in seconds. Instead, she chose patience. She chose observation. She chose leadership. Months later, visitors entering Fort Liberty often noticed something unusual about the main gate. Procedures were thorough. Standards were high. Yet the atmosphere remained professional and respectful. Many never realized the reason. They never knew that a simple encounter on an ordinary morning had become part of the installation's culture. One evening, as the sun settled beyond the training fields, Ethan completed his final inspection of the day. The American flag moved gently above the entrance. Vehicles continued entering and leaving. Fort Liberty carried on with its mission. Ethan glanced toward headquarters in the distance and remembered the woman who had arrived alone, carrying nothing more than a small bag and a calm smile. He remembered the assumptions he made. He remembered the lesson she taught, without ever raising her voice. Then he returned to work, because that lesson had become part of him now. And somewhere inside headquarters, Brigadier General Ava Mitchell continued leading exactly the same way she had led on her first day. Quietly, fairly, consistently, proving through action what every great leader eventually understands. Respect is never demanded. It is earned.